will control the vertical.
Welcome to Anthologic, the TV anthology podcast. I am your host, Mark. Anthologic is a podcast dedicated to exploring the good, the bad, and the odd of horror, science fiction, and the best of mystery suspense anthology shows and series on TV. Join me as we slip through the cracks of reality to approach the extremes of experience, where we can peruse the stories and art of a sinister fairground of strange and wonderful rides. And now we go on to the show that is the focus of this particular episode. Welcome to this episode of Anthologic. Today I'm covering a show called Out of the Unknown. This is a British TV sci-fi and occasionally horror anthology series that started in 1965. That ran for 4 series. It was fairly successful, spanning 1965 to 1971. The first 2 series were in black and white. The second 2 series were in colour. And it's an interesting series. It was nominally sci-fi for the first few seasons, but then it kind of turned to horror. And its origin's interesting. It actually began life kind of. Its ancestor, as it were, was a series called Armchair Theatre, which was a British TV anthology series of like one-off plays, quite, fairly long. I think about 75 minutes per play. It may have varied because it did run for quite some time. It actually ran from 1956 to 1974, and while Out of the Unknown was kind of a spin-off of it, it outlived its creation, as it were. That ran for a fair old time. However, from that, involved in that was a character called Sidney Newman, a Canadian-born producer who made a big splash in the UK TV in the early 60s and late 50s. He is the instigator, for example, of Doctor Who, for one, and The Avengers, the one with Steed and Emma Peel and such like. He that's some of the series he's been responsible for, and this one we're going to be talking about, among others, and also Armchair Theatre and so on. Armchair Theatre, at some point there was a feeling that they could spin off Armchair Theatre into like a sci-fi to a sci-fi vibe. There was a backdoor pilot, I believe, in Armchair Theatre called something like The Unknowing Martian or something like that. I can't quite remember. And that spun off into a show called Out of This World. And that was hosted by Boris Karloff. That ran for 13 episodes, and that was reasonably successful. Now, involved in that particular production was a lady who was like helping to run the show. She created this, actually. She suggested it to see Sidney Newman, and she kind of created it. Her name was Irene Shubik. Pretty much all the episodes are no longer available. They've disappeared. Apart from one, there is one episode left, which is still quite hard to get hold of. It's fairly expensive to buy, so I haven't got around to that. However, the success of this show then prompted a follow-up series, and the idea was that Irene was that it be based on sort of mostly famous sci-fi short stories with the occasional sort of original screenplay. So that was her idea, and that they kind of rolled that into this Out of the Unknown. Now, I find this fairly interesting. Sidney Newman was involved in Doctor Who, but the producer of that was a woman, Verity Lambert, and it's interesting that this other sci-fi series from the 60s was also sort of show run, produced, whatever, by a woman, Irene Shubik. So that's a really interesting that sort of British sci-fi in the 60s was like instigated by female producers. I find that really interesting, given how things were back then. Just an aside, I haven't really got much more to say about it. I just think it's quite refreshing to be aware that kind of thing was happening then. let's get back to our Out of the Unknown. This, as I say, ran for 4 seasons, and it was initially black and white and then transitioned to colour. Now, I have got the box set of this series, but it hasn't got every episode. Some episodes are missing, and some of the ones talked about rather fondly are missing, which is a real shame. But, there's still a fair number of episodes available. The first episode aired is the one I'm going to be talking about tonight, and that was called No Place Like Earth. Now, this wasn't the first one made. There was a few others made. They had 3 in the can before they wanted to air it, and they had to decide which ones to show. One's preferred over the other for various reasons. One that everyone liked, but it was written by someone hardly anyone had heard of. They were considering, but they settled on this one, No Place Like Earth, mainly because the writer of it was based on a short story by John Wyndham. Now, John Wyndham was up and coming, and fairly famous as a sci-fi writer at this time, Day of the Triffids, Midwich Cuckoos, and so on. So by taking one of his short stories, they felt it would open the series with a bang. However, there was some reluctance about this because it conveyed some things about the planet Mars that had very recently, at the time of the production in 1965, shown not to be true. For example, it shows canals and a sort of a rocket, a probe had demonstrated that there weren't canals of water or bodies of water on Mars, and they didn't want to be laughed at. However, they just still went ahead with it, and it was rubbished, I believe, by some sort of critics or scientific correspondents, but the series grew in stature as the weeks passed, and it was kind of well respected and well liked and watched. It was also one of the earlier programs on the fledgling channel BBC Two. BBC Two as a channel had only really just started when this aired, so it was kind of interesting that this series got sort of was used in the early days of BBC Two. This particular episode, I mean, every episode I think ran for about an hour was the idea. This one ran a little shorter than that, 52 minutes, and it's an interesting one. As I say, it's basically starts with the premise that humans got to Mars and other planets. They talk about the moons of Jupiter being populated and Venus being populated, but in some way that's not particularly specified, the Earth got blown up, so there's no way of getting back. And they think most of the rocket ships went with it, which means these men, who I think were miners, are stranded and sort of stuck on this planet. Now, we only really encounter a few Earthmen at this point, but there are also Martians who look human, act kind of human. Their teeth are slightly different, but they are there. And the man of who this centres on, this particular story, is like a tinker, a handyman. He just kind of wanders around fixing things and getting on with it. His name's Bert Foster. Now, it's interesting that there's all these kind of structures on Mars, like ancient buildings, and he visits people and fixes their stuff. Martians as well as humans. And there's a woman, an older Martian woman called Annika, who has a daughter, Zalo, and they're very kind of passive and easygoing and meek and kind of wise. They got these weird pet things that are like they're dogs with costumes on, basically. And sort of Bert's reasonably happy just going around doing his stuff. And it's interesting. The vibe of it feels a bit Star Trek. Now, this was made a year before Star Trek, funny enough, but there is a definite vibe. The women are kind of very... They got lovely hair and like look very nice and stuff like that, and they seem to be fairly amenable to... Let's put it that way. For example, Annika keeps suggesting that possibly Bert's place is with them, suggesting he marry Zalo, and he kind of ignores the hints, actually. But then what happens is a rocket ship lands and everyone sees it and they think, oh, maybe it's a rescue party or something. But it turns out it's from Venus. There is one functioning rocket ship from Venus, and this guy's basically trying to get some of the Earthmen to come back with him to help. And he tells them their jobs are as foremen, trying to rebuild civilization, and they got one functioning ship. He kind of gets suckered in, despite the fact he seems relatively happy where he is. He gets suckered in, goes back. So the first act is really him establishing me on Mars. There's a kind of also established that the Earthmen that are left are kind of drinking their days away. They're just mourning the loss of Earth and not really engaging with Mars and just drinking and trying to forget. And so it feels like the sort of human race is sort of decaying somewhat. The guy from Venus is kind of a recruitment officer. He said, no, if you come to Venus, we're building a new paradise there. What we really need is men, capable men, who can act as foremen to oversee, the work that's going on. And he's like, okay. And he says, there are buildings, there are wives and things like that. So it's got a very parochial view of sort of men and women and stuff. And that kind of reflected in the sort of the fact the Martian women are, sort of compliant and easygoing and slightly submissive in their nature, which feeds into like a goofy 50s sort of the mythology of, beautiful women on a planet waiting for men to come save them or whatever. It's got that kind of feel, so it feels a bit archaic actually. However, with this, he goes back to Venus and then he finds out it's not quite as it was sold to him. Every room we see in is fairly bare and austere. There are cameras on the walls, which they kind of have to hide from to talk. There's messages up on the screen saying things like, increase productivity, increase output, Venus is the future, things like that. So these bland messages, which are a bit Orwellian, they feel a bit like 1984. They also reminded me a bit of John Carpenter's They Live, with these messages, subliminal messages, but these were like not subliminal, they're just written up. And I found that kind of interesting. But he starts talking to a chap called Freeman who tells him that like it is. He goes, yeah, they'll keep promising you things, but it'll never happen. They'll say, if you work hard for a few years, you'll be a citizen. But when you're a citizen, oh no, sorry mate, you can't have a wife. There's a waiting list, and you're quite right at the bottom. And he goes, they'll keep promising you things, but you never really comply. And if you don't comply, they'll take away your citizenship. And essentially, they're overseeing this sort of submissive animal race, which is kind of unpleasant. They're kind of smaller humanoids. They wear these kind of outfits so you can't see what they look like. They've got like crash helmets on, but they make this sort of chirruping noise. It's basically an allegory of slaves and empire building and stuff like that. And he doesn't like it. He doesn't like sort of whipping these things to work harder, and everyone's telling him he's got to, and he kind of rebels. Turns out there's this weird, I think they call it the Venus rose or something like that could consume humans' flesh, as well as it might look kind of pretty, but not really. But they're these massive plants, and he kills the main sort of overseer who keeps telling him what he has to do and puts him in a plant. But he steals this powerful gun from him, and he goes on the run. And basically he disguises himself and gets on a jet back to the rocket ship back to Mars. I'm going to spoil this, by the way. It's hard to come by though, so yeah. And the second act is him on Mars and being sort of disillusioned by it all and realising that it's just the same old humanity doing its stuff. He gets back to Mars by disguise, and then he chooses to use the gun to blow up the ship, which seems murderous, but there you go. And then he just goes back. And you think there's going to be some sort of twist there, like the ship killed the Martians or something. But no, he just goes back and he sort of welcomes, and it appears he's going to be shaking up with Zalo at some point. Okay. I like some of the recreations of the Martian landscape. There's some really nice match shots where he's on basically a lake, or it looks like a boat on a lake, but the background is these stark crystalline mountains. It's kind of cool looking. Apparently it was all done on a little boating lake or a pond near the producer's house with his children on the boat. But because it's a kind of mid or long shot, you can't tell it's children. Apparently originally the production went up to Scotland claiming they needed to film there, but really that was only because one of the staff wanted to visit their relatives. And it was Scottish, and another one was the director was like a gourmet, and he wanted to try some of the eateries around Loch Lomond. So it was a bit of a scam from them to go to Scotland, a freebie to Scotland, kind of thing, which the producer was not happy about. So there was all that going on. Interestingly, there's a few actors in this you may recognise. There is Hannah Gordon plays Zalo. Now she's a British TV actress. She's kind of well known if you're of a certain age, like my age, but she's not that well known from movies or anything like that. There is an actor called Alan Tilvan in this who is kind of talking to Bert. Alan Tilvan is probably best known as playing the medium, the studio mogul in Who Framed Roger Rabbit. I think his name is Maroon, R.K. Maroon. He He's an English actor, but he does a good American accent, so he played that, for example. There's also, we see an actor called Bill Treacher turn up in a bit part where he barely speaks. In fact, I don't think he did speak. For British listeners, he was Arthur Fowler in EastEnders, so that he was very young in this, kind of interesting to see. And finally, we also get a few lines from a very young Geoffrey Palmer. Geoffrey Palmer is a sort of well-known actor. He looks like a British Walter Matthau, really. He's kind of in various comedies and occasionally movies. I think he's played like one of the senior naval people in a few James Bond films, for example. And he's probably best known for being in a sitcom with Judi Dench called Time Goes By, or if you go back to earlier than that, from a sitcom called Butterflies. He was the husband of Wendy Craig's character. He's well known. So it's kind of interesting to see those. Now, this is a little ponderous, but I found it quite interesting. As I say, it's based on a John Wyndham short story, which I tried to acquire, but it turns out it's out of print, and you can buy old versions of the hardback. It's a collection of short stories. It's one of the short stories. But unfortunately, the going price for the hardback second hand is about £160, so obviously I'm not going to buy that. So unfortunately I couldn't get to read the original source material, but I did listen to the audio commentary, and the scholar, John Wyndham scholar who was on the audio track, said the story and was fairly faithful, and a lot of the dialogue was lifted straight from the page. So it's a reasonably faithful reproduction of the short story, from what I understand. It was okay. It was 52 minutes. I quite enjoyed it. I kind of have a high tolerance to that kind of thing because I watch a lot of old Doctor Who, Quatermass. So if it may not suit everyone, but I found it interesting and was glad I got to it. So yes, as I say, Out of the Unknown, it is available as a set, but there are quite a lot of missing episodes, but I will eventually get around to watching them and probably talking about them on here at some point, but we'll see. Okay, that's it for this one. So bye from me, and can I ask, is anybody out there?
We now return control of your television set to you until next week at this same time, when the control voice will take you to